Why did you get involved in cult-related matters?
Okay, well, a student came to me in around 1997 and said that she had been born and raised in a Bible-based cult and that she was interested in doing a PhD on the subject. And I'd actually supervised her undergraduate dissertation on a different topic. And I had studied prejudice and social influence previously, and that had been the subject of my own PhD. So I was kind of interested in that subject. And about 6 months into her PhD, she came to me and said that she had found this conference in America, this strange titled organization, the American Family Foundation, in Philadelphia. And was there any funds in the department to send us? So we investigated this. And lo and behold, there was. So the student and I both came over to Philadelphia in 1998. That was my first visit to the United States. So actually this year, 2018, marks the 20th year of me coming to AFF ICSA conferences. By the way, I should say that student's name is Lois Kendall, who is known to quite a lot of people in the cult field as one of the pioneers really of doing work around second generation members, and she subsequently published a great book on that subject. But that was our first time, my first time here, and I met some incredible people. I remember vividly being greeted by Herb Rosedale, as many did back in those days, which was a really warm and genuine greeting that I'll never forget. I also remember being shown into this very busy little room and being introduced to Michael Langoni for the first time as well, which was a great experience too. And just on a personal level, I met a group of colleagues from Philadelphia in 1998, one of whom Linda went on to be my wife in a number of years later. So that trip, in many respects, really changed my life in many, many ways. One of the other things that it did, a year later, I was in Minneapolis, St. Paul for the AFF conference, and I heard Dennis Turish give a talk about democratic centralism in far-left groups. And I actually had a kind of epiphany and a realization that I had actually been in a cult myself. That wasn't something I'd really thought about deeply at that time. I'd been in a far-left revolutionary Marxist group for 4 years and then joined another one for several years after that. And it was very unpleasant and abusive, and I even recruited my sister into the organization, to my chagrin. But I hadn't really thought of cults as being political groups. Like a lot of people who are not in the field, I just perceived them to be religious, like the Moonies or Jehovah's Witnesses. I didn't think of them as political, and that was a real turning point for me. So I then started to do research myself into democratic centralism and the Marxist-Leninist theory of party building, but also developing my understanding of how coercive influence operates across context, the fact that it's not dependent on a particular type of ideology or even necessarily on ideology at all, but is all down to the processes of coercion that take place in that situation. So I'll be forever grateful to both Lois Kendall, who was then at her, she was actually at Linda and my wedding a number of years later, but as Michael and I have often joked about that we were in certain respects the AFF ICSA wedding or couple, not a mass wedding thankfully, just one wedding in this case, but I was always grateful to Michael for putting me in touch with Linda, and also Steve Eichel too, who's a really good friend of mine. So that's how I got involved in the field.
How did you become involved in the ICSA program, or we say AFF/
Yes.
ICSA?
Well, initially, the first time I presented with Lois Kendall around her research that I was supervising as a PhD supervisor.
When was that?
That was actually in 1999.
Was that at Buckingham?
No, I presented in the AFF conference in Minneapolis, St. Paul.
She was doing a dissertation.
Yes.
Where?
Oh, yes, sorry, yes. Lois was doing her PhD at what's now called Buckinghamshire New University. It wasn't called the same thing back then, but that's its current name.
Right.
But no, she presented, I contributed to that paper for the first time. And then a year later in 2000, I had the fortune to meet and talk at length to Ron Burks, who at that time was working at the Wellspring Retreat and Resource Centre. And later that year, I went out to Wellspring for the first time and met Paul Martin. And that started a 9-year collaboration between Paul and I, stopped tragically, of course, by his untimely death that year, and that's something I regret deeply, as so many do in the field. But in that time, I worked with Paul and Ron and all the other great colleagues at Wellspring, and Linda contributed to that too, and we really got to grips with the data that they had of over 560 former members of abusive groups and relationships, and we analysed that data thoroughly. We also cleaned the data up, and I'm grateful to colleagues like Pete Malinowski and others for their contribution to that too. And out of that came some key findings, one of which was that there appears to be a group-related psychopathology. In other words, the depression, dissociation and anxiety that people were reporting has a group-related element to it that's distinct from the generalized anxiety, depression and dissociation that people might feel for other reasons. And that out of that, I developed the totalistic identity theory with Paul, and which I've published on subsequently. And the tragedy, obviously, is that Paul didn't live to see that being published, and that was really sad. But he really is a huge figure in the field for all that he achieved with Wellspring. And I think the key lesson there is that we need more dedicated rehabilitation treatment programs of that type for people that are survivors of this kind of abuse, and the importance of a psychoeducational model. That was the key thing we found, highly effective in treating the group-related aspects of the psychopathology. And it demonstrated really, I think empirically for the first time, and it's been shown subsequently, that there really was a group aspect to the damage, that there was group harm. And what that meant is that certain people, the so-called apologists, who had claimed that these were just all apostates, unhappy with the group, that it really did prove that was not true, that the groups do harm some people some of the time, to partially quote Michael Langoni's take on that matter. It's not the same for everyone, no one's ever claimed that it is, but nor is it the case that groups don't harm people. It's just a revolving door. It's actually a lot more complex than that.
Where does the Svengali fit into this, where it's one-on-one? Is that in the theory?
It fits with the theory, the idea of a one-on-one, because basically people fall in love either with a group or with a person, and either takes the person over such that it dominates the person's identity, and then the actions that people are undertaking, they're actually doing it for themselves, because their whole identity, who they are, is bound up with the person or with the group. So that explains why you look from the outside sometimes on people in groups or people in abusive relationships. You think, why on earth are they with that person? Why on earth do they stay with that group? And when I look back on my own experience, I think exactly the same thing. And then the point is, at that time, when you do the crazy things, when you do the things that are harmful, you're doing them because you think that that's good for you, because it reinforces that part of your identity that is dominated at that time by the group or the person, what I call the totalistic identity. So it's a form of referent information influence within social psychology. It's self-referential. I'm not saying that the groups are not abusive or the individual is abusive. They're terribly abusive, and the people should be taken to task legally and other forms for that. But the nasty, horrible psychological trick that they play, and which then becomes self-reinforcing, is the fact that they inculcate and indoctrinate the person such that they believe that they're really doing it for themselves, when actually they're doing it for the leader or for the abusive person. And of course, that's the process that carefully needs to be unpicked through exit work, which is another story again of how dedicated people do that with individuals.
Paul was a devout Christian, I think. But did that have a particular influence on his approach to things intellectually as well as practically?
It meant that he was very sensitive, Paul, to people who also had concerns spiritually about their experience, because everyone's different, everyone's unique. I strongly believe that, and so when people present with psychological distress, sometimes they talk about that in spiritual terms. If spirituality is important to them, they'll frame it in that way, and Paul was great at being able to adjust how he worked with individuals. I mean, obviously didn't sit on the sessions with him, but I talked with him a lot about the approach that he took. And so where people were looking for a way to reclaim, in a sense, their spirituality and their religion, he was very well equipped to do that. When people didn't need that, he didn't, I know he didn't voice that on them, but it's a very important component for people, I think, and it's the same in politics too. You know, how do you replace that harmful ideology with something that's not harmful, and how do you find a spirituality or a belief system of a different type that is going to be beneficial and nurturing. And I do think it's important for counsellors, psychotherapists, psychologists, mental health professionals generally to be aware of those issues and to be able to speak in that language. And not everyone can do everything, so there are certain people who probably specialise more in the spirituality side and people who specialise more in other aspects. And Paul was kind of unique in being able to do all of that, I think.
In what ways did AFF ICEP influence you in your approaches intellectually? I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, probably in numerous different ways, and I'll try and pick just a couple of examples of that, probably. I think it influenced me around, along with some other organisations I did some work with, the value of involving survivors and people affected by the phenomenon of, in this case, cultic abuse or undue influence in the process of research and in the process of creating new knowledge. And I actually think that's a profoundly empowering and democratic thing, because it requires from the researcher or from the academician letting go of their superiority complex that you often find that they have and the verbiage that goes alongside it. I know that's a verbiage I'm guilty of, probably including in this discussion, but it comes kind of with the territory, but hopefully not the superiority so much. It's something I'm very mindful of, and I think that when people open themselves and talk about their experience, that's a rich source of knowledge. I mean, we might call that data empirically, and it's of a huge value in and of itself, and it's there, I think, and should be there to remind everyone, including scholars and researchers, about the fact that they're dealing with real people. This is real life, and there is a tendency sometimes with scientists to kind of take that stance that you're doing an experiment on people or you're judging people without that commitment to their well-being or their development. So AFF ICSA has always been, I think, a real place where all of that comes together, and that means that it can occasionally be perilous territory, because you have people who are survivors, former members, alongside academicians who've sometimes not been affected personally by the issue, and that can sometimes create friction. But of course, without a degree of friction, often things don't move forward. So I think it's been tremendously beneficial to a number of people, but just speaking personally for me, to realise the value of sort of ideographic research, of listening to people, listening to their stories and triangulating that data with the kind of more empirical approach to data analysis that I was speaking of earlier, to do with the Wellspring research. So that's one key area. The importance of doing research carefully and not making judgments, and alongside that, the corollary to that, which I think is one of diversity and plurality. And I'll talk about why they're related in my view, because I heard Rosedale said this, that, you know, against judgments based on superficial classification. In other words, we should make judgments based on a careful analysis of the evidence. What that means is that, you know, grandiose statements or simple answers are rarely found. It's a lot more nuanced and complicated than that. That doesn't mean one shouldn't have empathy for people who are hurt, and one shouldn't judge it differently, but it does mean that understanding why and also understanding the recovery for people is a tremendously individual and person-centered thing if one takes that position, which is against a sort of polarized view which some people take within the field, and which goes then to the other aspect of that, which is to do with the plurality and diversity, which I think AFF and ICSA has always personified. And that, I think, is a great illustration of what can be created in society more generally. You know, if we're looking in the end at what's the antidote going to be in the future to abusive influence or coercive control, it's got to be creating communities where people develop authentic relationships based on an appreciation of diversity and pluralism, where people aren't judging each other harshly, and where there is difference, yes, but where that's celebrated rather than negatively judged. So I think, and this is not a political thing, this is not me making a case for one type of politics over the other, far from it. It's actually about saying that we should celebrate diversity in politics. I often make this joke, it's not really a joke actually, I actually prefer it when people don't agree with me about things. I actually find that a lot more interesting than when people do. And there's also, I remember there's a column in a British newspaper that says, if I ruled the world, what would I do? My answer to that genuinely is that if I ruled the world, I would make sure that nobody ruled the world, because that's the whole root of unhealthy relationships and unhealthy societies. So without getting too grandiose about AFF ICSA, I think it has been and continues to be an organisation that offers that hope in terms of an alternative way of doing things. And I think looking ahead to the future, we have to join up, as we've been doing, with like-minded organisations, like-minded communities across the world, really, in terms of developing not just that message, but that practical approach to listening, sharing, but then developing practical solutions to the problems that people are faced with abuse and coercion, but also using that to influence policy, so that we can one day, hopefully, not be having to deal with as much of this problem. I mean, I genuinely look forward to the day when we can eradicate a lot of these problems that we face.
Have you had any problems with Celtic groups in the history of your involvement? Have you had any issues over the years?
I've not had serious problems with groups coming after me. I've had negative comments on social media and things like that, but I've not had a concerted attempt by groups to do that, and I'm not claiming that there's any particular reason for that. Although what I would say is this: that whenever I've met with people from groups, and particularly when that's set up in a fairly conflictual way. I mean, I was on British television with my wife Linda a few years ago, and we were sat there with some other people from the so-called anti-cult movement, and across the way were some cult members, so they wanted us to have a big argument. And I said I think it was to the representative from the Unification Church, that I respected the fact that he was genuine in his belief for his religion. But what I didn't respect was the fact that harm had been caused to people in that organisation, and that I couldn't see how the Unification Church was addressing that. And I said, dialogue with us, open your organisation up to genuine scrutiny, not because I'm trying to change your beliefs, not because I'm trying to get you outlawed or anything, but because you should have a duty of care to your parishioners, to your congregation, and at least superficially that was very well received. The practical problems then of actually doing that is another matter entirely, but I do think that should be the approach that is considered a lot of the time, because I think that does open up the opportunity on occasions for groups to reform, particularly if the original leader or guru is no longer there. And of course, in the case of the Unification Church, that's exactly the situation. So,
what about colleagues in academia?
Yeah.
And their views, if any, for your work in this controversial field?
Well, the views of work in Celtic studies, I think, has changed over the last 20 years. I mean, when I was first doing work in this area, the typical reaction when I said Celtic studies, particularly over in the UK, was, well, first of all, people think it's Celtic studies, firstly. So they're disappointed that I don't have an interest in Welsh or Scottish history. I do, actually, but not through this area of research. But then, of course, they believe that you're only interested in certain religious groups or in religiosity, or that even you take an anti-religious stance or have a vested religious point of view. And I don't come to this field from that vantage point. I don't want people to believe in my particular version of spirituality, which is a particular form of Judaism. So I don't try and do that. So, but going back to the question, it's been judged as left field, as a minority interest, that people don't understand. Historically, that was the case. It's hard to get published in mainstream journals, I found, along with lots of other people. But I have to say, over the last 10 years in particular, the notion of what a cult is, both in terms of its relationship, say, with radicalization and terrorism, I think the term cult is being used more often now to explain that phenomenon, just in the same way as Celtic influence is being used more to explain coercive persuasion in domestic settings and also in trafficking. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that ICSA has really broadened its work into those adjacent fields, and we found many times people that are very open and welcome to having those conversations. I mean, here at the conference this year in Philadelphia, we have people who've been doing work for decades in the domestic violence field or in the anti-trafficking area, or doing work to combat racism and far-right extremism, and they may not have thought about cults in so many words, but as soon as you talk about that notion of Celtic influence and the way that coercive persuasion works, they of course see the overlap and the connection. So gradually, I think in certain discipline areas, particularly more in psychology, more in health science or nursing areas, social work, I think it's a much more fertile area for people that do work on cults than before. Less so perhaps in sociology, where there's still probably still a bit of a war going on between sociologists of religion and those people who have dedicated themselves to understanding why people are harmed.
Do you, would you prefer not to use the word cult in Celtic? It's difficult. We agonized over that, and Margaret Singer came up with this long sentence, which is not really serviceable.
I'm okay with the term cult and cultic, depending on the context, which is a bit of a cop-out, but in one sense. But I use it where I feel that it's understood, and if I don't feel it's understood, I use alternative terms like extremist group or coercive persuasion or coercive control. But I'm not ashamed of the term, and I think that I think more people than ever actually understand about cults and what cults are about. So I think it has great utility. I think for ICSA, I think that the question and the difficulty always is, if you're not Celtic studies, if you're not an organisation that's about cults, what term are we going to use that's going to have greater explanatory value than the one that we have already? So I'm not the biggest fan of cult, but nor am I convinced that there's necessarily a compelling alternative that would be any better in terms of the breadth. It's difficult for certain professionals, and I think I've said this to many people, use the terms that work in your fields and for the people that you're talking to. And I know it's a big issue as well for some second generation or third generation former members, because they didn't join the group of themselves initially, they were born or raised. The term cult sometimes doesn't have the same degree of resonance for them. So if it doesn't have resonance for you, if it doesn't work for you, you don't have to use the term. But I think we're broad enough in terms of our areas of work and inquiry that I don't think the title of the organisation matters that much.
Are people in Britain as quick to call interest in study of cultic organizations and the like accuse such people of anti-religion the way they do in the United States, or the way they did?
Yeah, some critics of people who do work in the cultic studies area accuse you of being either anti-religious or making value judgments about religions. In other words, as soon as you use the word cult about a group, therefore you're judging them negatively. I actually avoid, as ICSA does, labelling individual groups as cults. I mean, there are exceptions to that. I feel quite comfortable describing the Cy Barber organisation as a cult. So, I mean, there are various ones where I don't have an issue, but I do think it depends on the organisation in question. But no, I think it has useful explanatory value, and therefore where people have said that, I simply explain what that term means in terms of the influence involved. But that has to come from an evidence base. So unless there's evidence to show that the group has a cultic influence, I'm loath to use the term. So I do understand why some people will say that they find the term in that sense unhelpful, and quite a lot of those people are very sympathetic actually to the harm that people are suffering. So I'm not talking here, I mean, there are particular academicians who've dedicated their lives to defending new religions, and they're the ones that are referred to as apologists, and it's difficult with some of those individuals to have the conversation because they really do believe that the people who complain about the harm of the apostates and that the people who support them are really just anti-religious zealots. And it's difficult with some of those individuals to have the dialogue, but one of the things I think has been great about ICSA is that we've tried, and that means that I think there has been a shift. So I think there are more scholars now of new religions who are open to the fact that some new religions, as they see them, can be harmful, and they're reading about that harm, and I think to a certain extent they care about it more than they used to. So you don't get everyone, but that dialogue I think has produced some benefits.
I'd like to turn now to something that you've been involved in a lot. You can tell me about the history of that involvement and what it's meant for ICSA. Mm-hmm. This is the international reach, which struck me as quite astounding.
Yeah.
Because I left before things really got rolling.
Yeah. Well, the name change from AFF to ICSA with the international title was a huge turning point, and also then the strategic decision that we came to have the conferences every other year in Europe, which has really broadened the base of involvement, particularly in Europe, but also I think it's encouraged more people from Australasia to come. They it's a generalisation here, but they tend to come more often to the European conferences than the conferences here in North America. So it's broadened the base of people that come from different countries, but it's also helped at the same time to broaden the focus, because by doing that, we've then been tapping into areas like, say, in recent years, radicalisation or the terrorist area in a different context to the United States or Canada, and it's allowed in that area, but also the same with regard to religious cults, the same with regard to trafficking or domestic violence, just that broader appreciation of the diversity of the problem, the fact that it's not, we're dealing with complexity a lot of the time. There may be some commonalities in terms of psychological and other processes, but what it's meant really is that the number of practitioners, the number of former members, the number of families involved has really broadened and become more diverse. So it's just been really great to get that perspective from different cultures, in different languages sometimes. I think the organisation has really grown tremendously qualitatively as a consequence of that.
Have you recruited? Pardon the expression.
Yes, I'm always slightly sensitive to that expression, having been charged with recruitment when I was in a cult myself, but I'm only kind of kidding there. Yes, I mean the organisation has, ICSA has recruited members in Europe. I mean, look, we made a decision to become a member-focused organisation. I think that was important. But I think with any member organisation, people have to ask the question, why would I become a member? Why can't I just come to the conferences? Perhaps it's because I'm a former member of a cult that I don't push that question particularly. I think it's important for people to make that judgment themselves about whether they actually want to sign up as a member or whether they want to just come to the conference. I think actually you become a member if you sign up for the conference for the first year, but then I think you have to sign up thereafter if you want to continue. I still think that there's a job of work in Europe, though, to create ICSA as something that's perceived more as a European-based organisation. We're celebrating our 40th year, and if I look ahead to the next 40, but perhaps more modestly ahead to the next sort of 10 years, I really hope we can establish ICSA with a European footprint as a network that does more of the work that's been done over here in North America, but also more of the work that we've started to do in more recent years in Europe, really in terms of bringing together practitioners, but also different organisations, and sharing knowledge, sharing expertise, and developing that knowledge and expertise. Recently, last year in Bordeaux, we did a joint meeting between ICSA and the Radicalisation Awareness Network, which is the European Commission funded network that does work around radicalisation, and particularly with the RAN Exit group, which does exit work from extremist groups. And we did a joint meeting, which was really exciting and interesting in terms of sharing perspectives, where maybe 10 years ago there wouldn't have been that appreciation from either side, really, that there was a commonality to not all cult members are terrorists, obviously, but a lot are radicalised in terms of their ideology, and the processes of indoctrination are very similar, and then the process of exit is very similar. So I think we can do a lot more of that. I think the functions that ICSA can have, both internationally but also in individual continents like Europe, like here in North America, and hopefully in the future in other continents of the world, is really to facilitate bringing together people, former members, families, professionals, academicians, and organisations that also have those people as part of them, who are doing valuable and important work, and to really take the knowledge base to the next level, so that the laws that we create are more sensible. Because my problem with the way that legislation works is that one piece of legislation is created, but the old legislation isn't necessarily gotten rid of. So you end up with contradictory pieces of law, and it's really important for the law to be based on evidence. And the importance of evidence-based legislation never been more important, and at the same time, actually, it's never been under greater threat, or maybe I could say there's probably never been less of it in evidence currently, if one goes from country to country. So I actually think, and again, this is not a party political point, it's just a point about how as communities, how as countries, we can develop laws that are based on evidence and which are empowering for people. And I think that networks, organisations like ICSA can do that, have a really important role to play, but they have to be based and rooted in the countries and communities of which they're part. And when I look ahead, I think that we have to, in that sense, root ourselves more in those communities, whether that's in Europe, in certain countries in Europe, whether that's in certain parts of the United States or North America, because that's where we're going to start to affect real change. That's where policymakers are going to start to listen to us and to the other organisations that we work with, because they will see, hopefully, the contribution that we're making alongside others to actually eradicating the causes of coercion and cultic abuse, as well as, of course, dealing with the after effects of it.
Oh, tell me about the journal.
Okay. Well, we created what's not really a new journal anymore, the International Journal of Celtic Studies. We conceived of that in 2009.
I typeset the whole thing.
You did? Okay. Well, the
Way
first,
back.
well, the predecessor journal, or the Celtic Studies Review.
The black 6x9
Yeah.
Celtic Studies Journal.
Yeah.
Sorry,
It's okay. It's okay. In 2009, I remember sitting outside at a restaurant cum bar in Geneva with Michael Angoni and Carmen Amandros and Deanne Cassoni and probably Mike Fofbelt as well, and we were talking about turning Celtic Studies Review into a more academically focused journal that had more of an international appeal. And that's where the International Journal of Celtic Studies came from. And we made the commitment then to publish in 3 languages, English, French and Spanish, which we've done since 2010 with the first edition. And we recreated the editorial board and also the reviewers based in academic institutions. And we have a full blind review process, the same as with any academic journal, to select the articles, and we go through a rigorous process of review as well as a rigorous editing process. It's very important that people have a place, I think, to publish research that's specifically on the cult phenomenon, on Celtic influence or coercive control. It's not the same as saying they haven't got other places they might want to publish as well, and there are of course journals with much higher impact ratings in the academic community than our journal, but we've published it now for 8 going on 9 years. We've published some marvellous work. There's some really important contributions to knowledge there. Of course, we'd like to do more of that. We'd like to broaden the range of articles in terms of where they come from, and of course we still have the concern about whether Celtic Studies is the right name for the journal, or whether a different name would be better. What I would say is that the journal is probably never going to be the journal that you get your tenure track from. In the United States, it's not going to be the career-making publication of choice. We could try and attach it in future years to an academic institution, get it published by their press. That'd be something worth exploring. But even then, we're never going to be up there with the top-ranked journals. So we need to, recognise the fact that the journal is still of immense value to several categories of academicians. It's of value to people starting out, early career researchers, grad students. It's also tremendous value, I think, to people who specialise in aspects or areas within Celtic studies and who might find it difficult to get published elsewhere. It's also a great place to reprint articles that have been published on relevant and related topics in journals elsewhere. So I'm, in one sense, very proud of it as co-editor, and it's been great to work with Dan and Carmen and Michael over the years, and Sharon Ham, the copy editor too. I realise its limitations at the same time, but I think, the old saying, you don't know what you've got until it's gone. If we didn't have ICSA, I think we would really miss it and realise the value it has. So, we can develop it and do a lot more with it, but I think it's been great, the fact that we've created it in that way.
I'll edit this out, but I think it's a wonderful achievement. Wonderful. I mean, I used to be an academic, and I get journals that now cost too much to get, but it's really quite wonderful.
Yeah,
really. How would you, or do you, bring in a younger generation?
Okay. I think any organisation, if it wants to attract young people, they have to really fundamentally ask younger people what they want from the organisation and be prepared not just to listen to that, but act on that, and almost set aside preconceptions about how we want to run our events or how we want to run the organisation. And I've observed this in so many different organisations, including in politics too. if you don't do that, then you're just perceived as being, you know, a bureaucracy that's set in its ways with a particular viewpoint that's exclusionary. And I think we have a big job of work to do to diversify the people that are involved with ICSA, and by that I mean ethnically diversify it in particular, but also in a profound way to bring in younger people from different communities, people who may not be academically orientated but who nevertheless have been harmed through abuse or coercion of different kinds, and that comes from rooting the organisation more in community-based work, because that's how I think you show as an organisation that you're relevant to the real lives that people are leading, and that you have creative solutions that might not be the solutions I want or the solutions you want, but are the solutions that people can agentically create for themselves. And I think that's how young people think and feel. They want to break out, I think, of the straitjackets of conformity and of the prejudice and discrimination that they face in their lives, and they want genuine hope that they can create communities and that are different to that. And I think if ICSA is going to flourish and grow with young people, it's got to be a beacon for that kind of grassroots activity for young people. And so we have to organise events and conferences that are open to that plurality and diversity. I've spoken about how much I value the pluralism and diversity in ICSA already, so I think we have a good foundation to build on in that respect. I think we're one of the most open and diverse organisations I've done work with, but we shouldn't be complacent about that. We've really got to continue to flip the conversation and open ourselves up to new ways of doing things, and the opposite of the sort of stereotypical bureaucrat who, when you first say how about doing this, the answer is no before you've even finished making the suggestion. I think our default answer should be yes, try that. Let's be creative, let's be experimental. Of course there are risks associated with that. We can always make the necessary risk assessments about it, but I think that's a risk worth taking, because I think that's what's really going to attract young people who've been harmed and who genuinely, I think, want to create a better world moving forward, and I think we all want to do that.